Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Joana Freitas. With us this evening we have Glenn Timmermans. The professor joined the Department of English of the University of Macau in 2001, where he has introduced the course of the Holocaust, Genocide and Human Rights. Holocaust studies in Asia is also another of his specialties. He's also a founding director and active board member of the Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Center. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us on the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. I would like to start exactly about the Holocaust. Last week we celebrated the 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it was a big celebration in Germany and also around the world. It counted with many leaders from around the world. Have you ever thought this wall ended up destroyed at one point?
I suppose it was always the hope, though I don't think anyone thought it would come down quite as soon as it did. I mean, I can tell you, when I was doing my PhD, there was this German student, a contemporary of mine, who was working on his PhD topic was the long-term effects of the Berlin Wall on the German economy. Mm-hmm. And obviously he had to change his PhD topic because suddenly the wall came down. So there was an expert on the Berlin Wall who was writing about the long-term implications, and he had to change his PhD topic. So no, I think that whole period in late 1890 when East European communist states fell like dominoes it was immensely exciting, but it was largely unexpected, given that only 7 years previously we had martial law in Poland. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of repression in Central and Eastern Europe. And East Germany was one of the most repressive of the communist states in Central Eastern Europe. So I think the Berlin Wall certainly came as a great surprise, mm-hmm. and a very pleasant surprise, though clearly it also introduced all sorts of major problems for Germany. I mean, the Germans have been remarkable the way they've incorporated the former East Germany into their economy.
When you say remarkable, in what sense?
Well, if you look at...
Because we do have people saying that the wall doesn't exist physically, but it's like an invisible wall.
Sure. I mean, East Germany is not as prosperous as the former West Germany, but still Germany today is, the third largest economy in the world, I think? I think was it the fourth? I think
from Europe, it's
the first. It's the first in Europe.
In Europe is the first.
I know it's the United States, China, I forget, it was either Japan or Germany, which is the third or fourth. But yet, as a country which has managed to incorporate many millions of people into a first world economy, yes, life in East Germany is still not as good as it is in the former West Germany, but nonetheless they've done a remarkable job in bringing the former East Germany up to very similar standards of quality of life. And I think the Germans one has to salute them for how they've worked together to make this happen. Clearly, there are problems. There are problems of the rise of the far right, the neo-Nazis,
exactly.
Which is something, it's not exclusive to the former East Germany, but it's certainly more dominant, more prominent in East Germany than in the former West Germany. The neo-Nazi far-right movement it's not simply in East Germany. We see it, I'm afraid, we see it in Hungary. We've been seeing it in Europe. And we even see it in Russia, which is so bizarre. I mean, the Russians without the Russians, the chances of the Allies winning the Second World War are slight. It was, much as we talk about the Americans and the British, it was the Russians who took the brunt of fighting Hitler. And yet today in Russia, you get a large far-right movement who feel nothing about walking around swastikas and doing the Hitler salute, which is bizarre.
That was actually one of the points that German Chancellor Angela Merkel actually talked about during the celebrations. She mentioned a rise in the far right, in the anti-Semitism, not only in Germany but in Europe, and not only what is happening in the world right now? Because it's not only Europe, it's not only Germany, it's
Sure.
everywhere. What is happening?
God knows. I mean, yeah, what is happening, because let's just take the one place one thought was stable, was normal, is the UK. And the UK is now a basket case. The UK, of all the countries, the UK has a reputation for being, to quote our previous Prime Minister, her cliched phrase, strong and stable. But the UK has always represented stability. And yet now we have a situation which is not unlike the United States. We have an equally bizarre blonde Prime Minister who is not 100 miles from the man who runs the Philippines, the man who now runs Brazil. And we can think of what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Russia has been happening for a long time. But yes, so there are these very strong populist leaders who've all suddenly risen to the fore, and it is deeply worrying. But particularly, I think, what's happening in the UK, because you are seeing a form of populism in the UK now, which one never expected, and it's all down to this bloody Brexit.
You were mentioning the current events, the election of presidents who create division, who defend racism, who are not tolerant, which is at this point, you mentioned something before in one of interviews, actually here on the talk show. You mentioned something interesting, which was and also in your papers. It's the lowest. The Holocaust was the lowest moment of the Western civilization. No one would think that this could happen. Now we cannot compare, of course, that event with what's happening now, but we are moving towards a less tolerant world. So do you, without comparing the Holocaust again with the current events, you also said people allow bad things to happen. Like, you mentioned the bureaucracy of evil, something that I found really interesting.
Right, yes.
Very interesting.
Yes.
How something bad to happen, people need to allow it. So
yes.
Why are people still allowing bad things to happen right at this moment?
Very much so. I think if you look at the world today, simply within the last 2-3 years, we have seen extraordinary atrocities, genocides. I mean, there's a genocide which is probably still ongoing, but certainly was in full force a year ago, not very far from here in Myanmar, with the Rohingya, a raging genocide. And interestingly, this was one of the very few times the United Nations actually had the guts to use the word genocide. Now, the United Nations is very reluctant to use the word genocide because once the UN recognizes something as genocide, then the UN is obliged to stop it. And the way the UN is constructed, the permanent members of the Security Council are very reluctant to interfere in other people's affairs. So we saw in Rwanda in 1994, we saw a reluctance on all the security members. No one wanted to use the word genocide. When the American Secretary of State was asked about, is this a genocide? She said, no, let's not use that word. There was this American fear of using the word genocide. So it was very interesting, a year ago, 2 years ago, that the UN talked about a genocidal situation in Myanmar. And yet, nobody did anything about it. I mean, the people who went to Myanmar to assist, to help the Rohingya, were individual aid agencies. It wasn't the United Nations, it wasn't individual countries, it wasn't the Security Council. It was Médecins Sans Frontières, it was the Red Cross, it was aid agencies through public charity who intervened.
There was a certain reluctance also in going there because it would prove that something was happening.
Yes, and there was this bizarre idea that Myanmar had very recently been brought back into the family of nations. I mean, Myanmar had been, for a long time, excluded. Tourists were discouraged from going there. And now suddenly they had this new president, wasn't the president, but she was the first state councillor, who rather disappointed everybody. But nonetheless, there was an attempt that this country was now part of the family of nations again, and let's give it the kid glove treatment. And so there was this reluctance to interfere. And we saw it again. I mean, again, you know, the countries, there are reasons for reluctance to interfere. There was a very real reluctance to interfere in Syria. Again, there were reasons for that, partly because of the idiocy and the madness of the Gulf War in the early 2002 to 2003 under the former American president, where the world should not have gone into. So there is this reluctance to go into the Middle East. But the genocide of the Yazidi was a genocide. And again, the world stood by. We wrung our hands. We watched it on television every evening, but nothing was really done about it. And now, horribly, you know, the Americans have withdrawn the few troops, and the Turks have been given free rein to take out the Kurds. And the Yazidi are yet again being exposed.
When you mention the fact that people know what's going on there, people as in the society, are they being selfish? As long as I'm okay, I don't have to worry about the other. And that's one question. The other is about when the Holocaust happened, which actually I found it interesting. I'm not sure if this is correct, but 9th of November was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the same day
it's also Kristallnacht.
that the Jewish started being prosecuted years before, 1938. Yeah. So and people also knew what was happening, right? The Allies knew what was happening. Winston Churchill, according to recent documents from 2-3 years ago, knew what was happening, and no one wanted to interfere in Nazi Germany. So what is did humanity learn anything with the Holocaust?
Not really. I mean, part of it's international politics. Part of it is we are bound by, nation states are bound by the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, where that changed, that created international law, which said that no country has the right to interfere in another country's state, in other countries' affairs, which was very interesting. In 1945-46, with the Nuremberg trials, the Germans could not be prosecuted on what they did to the German Jews, because what the Germans did to the German Jews was an internal matter. Because by the Treaty of Westphalia, what you do to your own people is nobody's business. And this still holds in many ways. That is why the United Nations Convention Against the Crime of Genocide is very important, because this gives the United Nations the power to intervene supranationally. So when a country is persecuting its own people.
That's from 1948, okay.
So but the United Nations, 48, introduced the Convention Against the Crime of Genocide, which allows countries to intervene when a people are being persecuted.
And from that moment until now, how many times has it happened?
None. Precisely because the United Nations now deliberately avoids using the word genocide, precisely to avoid invoking that convention. So you have, in Rwanda, we saw the world stood by. In Srebrenica, in Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia. NATO got involved, but we saw the Russians and the Chinese supporting the Serbians. So that became a sort of realpolitik, Cold War extension. Each side was supporting its client states. Today we have, again, certain members of the United Nations supporting their client states. The Russians and the Chinese tend to support each other against and look after certain countries. And France, Britain, and America tend to club together and look after their client states. And all five have the veto at Security Council, so basically nothing ever happens.
So when they do talk, when they do mention, like we have now the situation in Hong Kong, for example, we have the U.S. always not interfering, but commenting on it. So when they do that, do you think that's actually for the interest of the people that are being victimized, or is a political interest that is there?
I like to think...
Not specifically in this case, but as an example, but also.
I mean, I'm not that cynical that I think every country interferes purely for particular reasons. I think, in answer to your earlier question, I think when we do see people in a situation which is not right, I think it's right that countries should say, oi, this is not right, and can you please stop it, or can we find a way? And I think it's wrong for countries always to say, but you're interfering in my internal affairs. I mean, obviously there are times when it is politically motivated, and there are times when it's not. And I think when we look at what was happening in Syria to the Yazidi or the Rohingya in Myanmar, for why on earth would... I mean, we saw people being killed, I mean, horribly. For not to interfere would be an absolute abrogation of all human morality. So no doubt there are situations where foreign powers wish to interfere, but I think we can't always use that as an excuse every time to defend ourselves against foreign interference.
When we go back to the question of society as a whole, not in political terms, but as people, individual people and people that work together for the good of a community. Yet again, when you mentioned that Holocaust happened because someone was making the schedules for the trains to take people, and that, do you think people are standing up currently? We see people protesting, but are they standing up for others?
People seem to be very single-minded. So the moment I think rightly, I don't want to detract from it, but I think the moment people who are engaged seem to be very engaged with the issue of the climate. And so you have a lot of activity around climate change and perhaps less concern about human rights. I mean, obviously, climate change impacts upon human rights because once the weather patterns change, which they are doing, there are going to be more and more droughts in Africa and elsewhere.
The poorer countries.
And poorer countries are going to suffer more and more, and that is going to impact on all sorts of human rights. So they're all tied together. But I think at the moment, the average person in the street is probably thinking more about climate change than he or she is thinking about human rights in countries, I'm not going to mention any particular names, but various countries in the world today which are having very serious problems. I want to go back to your question you asked a moment ago about why don't people act. There's a passage in a book by Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher who's now at Princeton, I think, where he has this example, I think, where he says, if you see somebody drowning in a river, what will you do? You will almost certainly jump in and save them. But if I tell you somebody's dying in Africa, you just shrug your shoulders. But why did you? It's the same thing. You could actually do something. You could send money. You could join an organization. You could actually, we suffer from what's it called, sympathy fatigue. But actually, we could not turn the page. We could, when there are appeals for charitable money, we could actually maybe do a bit more and not just think, oh, well, it's another country far away. It's not my people, it's not my concern, and turn the page.
But do you think that's being selfish, or it's the way society is now constructed and the way people learn how to deal with what's happening in the world? Because there's so much happening at the same time.
Sure. I mean, I suppose we can't individually save the whole world, but but we can, each of us, make an effort. I do think if each of us speaks up against oppression, if each of us raises our voice when necessary, and going back to the bureaucracy, if we don't simply tick the boxes, if we ask, why am I ticking this box? If I tick this box, will somebody somewhere, I might not know, will they nonetheless be affected? It's a chain reaction, and I obviously this is all very idealistic, but I do think the least we can do is question. It's not take things for granted. It's not just accept that this is the way the world is.
Do you think that when people think about human rights and the lack of them, most of people, at least the first thought is people being tortured, physically abused, or not having the basic needs that they need. But human rights also convey the oppression, people being oppressed. And there are countries where that is happening, at least to the eyes of people from outside of that country. But do you think that everywhere in the world people are aware that it what is happening might be a breach on human rights?
No, I mean, I think a lot of people, just in my teaching the subject, I realize a lot of people are completely ignorant of the very idea of human rights. I mean, a lot of people simply don't understand the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, again, 1948, is a very idealistic document. That we're all born free and equal. We all have the right, the freedom of movement, and the freedom of religion, and the freedom of this, and the sexes are treated equally, blah, blah, blah. Very few countries actually practice that. I mean, even in the most liberal Western democracies, there is still a certain amount of discrimination against women, or there's, even in most liberal Western democracies, certain religious groups still suffer some religious discrimination. So no country has a perfect record of human rights. But I think in countries where there are very few human rights, I think most of the people in those countries are probably not ignorant that they even have such a thing as human rights.
You're in Macau since 2000. You're in Macau since 2001.
Long time.
And since 2011, you've been supervising the various
2008.
Okay, supervising some studies. One of them is between the Holocaust and the Nanjing massacre.
Yeah.
You also introduced the course of Holocaust, genocide, and human rights that we just talked about. How do you see the understanding of these concepts specifically in Macau and in China?
Fortunately, there's certainly a very real and I think sincere interest. I mean, most people in Macau do not know very much about the subject. They have a vague notion, usually from cinema. They've probably seen a film like Schindler's List or The Pianist. They've seen a film in which the Holocaust featured, and so have a very vague notion about, they all know Jews suffered in Europe. And there was a man called Hitler who did this. But that's probably the extent of their knowledge. So when they learn about it, most of them do find it genuinely interesting. And I think they do find not just the subject interesting, but the questions it gives rise to. Now today, actually this morning, we had a class, we've just finished the Holocaust, but later in the semester than I planned. But today we actually just looked at the whole idea of good and evil, and the very ideas we have of good and evil in our society, and how we understand. I mean, you can't think about the Holocaust without looking at the notions of good and evil. And these are obviously ideas which impact on all parts of life, not just the Holocaust. And so I think the subject gives rise to quite profound ethical questions, which people don't necessarily think about.
So they start perceiving the situation as a problem, is the good and evil on that sense, specifically on the Holocaust theme, is it the same in both your and my culture, Western countries, and your Asian students? I
think so, because what we talk about in the Holocaust, the one brief little good thing about the Holocaust, good thing which came out of the Holocaust, well, those few people we call the righteous among the nations, those few non-Jews who risked and sometimes lost their lives to save Jews. And these are the most extraordinary people who ever lived, I think. Why would you risk your life to save a stranger? I mean, this goes against all evolutionary teaching. The Darwinists teach us that life is all about self-preservation and reproduction. And yet here you have people who actually open their doors to complete strangers took them in for often 2 or 3 years, had to feed them.
Risk themselves.
And if they were caught, not only would they be killed, but often, certainly in Poland, their whole families would be killed. And so this goes against nature. Why risk your and your family's life to save a stranger? And people did this. And so I think it throws up the question of going back to why do we help people? Why do we save people? Why do we react? Why are most of us indifferent? Most of us are indifferent, let's be honest. 99% of us are utterly indifferent to everybody else. Why are there some people who are not? And today there are about 25,000 people recognized by Yad Vashem in Israel as righteous among the nations. And the fascinating thing about these 25,000 people is they have nothing in common. Some were Polish peasants, some were aristocrats. Prince Philip's mother is one of them. So you have a member of the royal family who's righteous among the nations. You have people who were deeply religious, nuns and Catholic priests. You have atheists. So none of these people, you can't say it's religion or it's education or it's class or it's nationality or it's race. And yet some people have this incredible moral core, which, when push comes to shove, they do what few of us will do, and that is risk their lives to save a complete stranger. And these, I think, in a secular age like today, where we no longer have saints, maybe these are the saints for the secular age, people who risk their lives and many times lost their lives for complete strangers.
Do you think that is because when that happened, the Holocaust happened, when at that time the evil wasn't something normal, and now we're having a new normal, we're normalizing the bad things that are happening, and that's why most of us, like you said, do not really care of what's going on, or do not open our doors and risk our lives?
I suppose it has to reach an extreme situation. I mean, the Holocaust was an extreme situation. We mustn't compare any situation to the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was an extreme situation. And nothing in contemporary society is there yet, though you see things like it in many, things like the persecution of the Yazidi in Syria, the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Those are mini Holocausts. There you are seeing the persecution of a minority in horrible ways because of racial or religious grounds. So there are these little mini Holocausts happening, but nothing on the scale that we saw in the middle of the 20th century. But I think, on the one hand, today we are better informed. There's no doubt about that. Today, one of the reasons the Holocaust could happen is once the war started, there was very little communication within Europe. So once the Jews of Poland were being persecuted, the Jews of Holland and the Jews of Hungary and the Jews of Romania didn't know about it. I mean, today we have much better communication. But of course, today we also have a lot of false communication. So on the one hand, while we have better communication, we do have a lot of false communication as well. Many truths.
Yeah.
So everything is relative, and that makes the situation, on the one hand, while we have better communication, it is undermined by the plurality of truth.
The large amount of information.
And that truth can mean whatever you want it to mean.
You mentioned that there's nothing like the Holocaust. There's no comparison possible of that scale. But we are currently, at this moment, seeing people using some expressions related to the Holocaust, like the word per se, Holocaust, and also Nazi. And I remember, for example, Hong Kong, the turmoil that is happening for the past half year, and China-Nazi is one of the expressions we've been seeing, not only written, but also said out loud. Is that offensive for someone that studies the Holocaust?
It is. I mean, I don't want to overreact. I mean, obviously, in an informal situation, obviously everybody misuses and abuses the word Nazi. As a school child, you probably called the teacher a Nazi occasionally. But when it comes to a political movement, as you see in Hong Kong at the moment, when there are accusations from both sides, they need to be much more careful. These are not school children. Neither the police nor the protesters are school children. They're deliberately invoking a period of history which is not relevant, which is not comparable to what's happening in Hong Kong now. So to call whether it's the police or the protesters Nazis is inappropriate because the situation is nothing like that. No one in Hong Kong is being sent to concentration camps. No one in Hong Kong, as far as I know, is being put in gas chambers or anything like that. So the situation is wrong, and I think it can be offensive. I don't think one needs to be, what's the word I'm looking for? One doesn't have to be overly sensitive. Obviously, these words are going to be used and abused, and one has to accept the word Nazi is a term of abuse. But I think when we've seen Hong Kong demonstrators, pictures of Carrie Lam with the Hitler moustache, and that is silly. It's offensive. But equally, when the police call the protesters cockroaches, that is also offensive, because calling anybody an insect is to dehumanize them. And that's precisely what we saw in Rwanda.
Yeah.
In Rwanda, before the killing started, on public radio, the Hutu called the Tutsi cockroaches. Before the Nanjing massacre, before the Japanese invasion of China, the Japanese called the Chinese ants. The Germans called the Jews rats. So when you describe somebody as vermin, whether it's cockroaches, ants, rats, you are calling them something which is less than human and something which should be killed. No, rats are vermin, cockroaches are vermin. We have insect spray to kill cockroaches. So you don't call people cockroaches and you don't call people Nazis. I mean, both sides have actually behaved badly, I think, in Hong Kong, whether it's the police or the protesters. They're both using terminology which is totally inappropriate I mean, what's happening in Hong Kong now is clearly very troubling. But my God, on the scale of human tragedy and human strife, it's actually very minor.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. I mean, thank God there's been one complicated death, chap falling off a roof at a car park, and some people shot. But really, by the standards of the rest of the world, this is hardly My Lai. This is hardly many other incidents you can think of in recent history where people have been shot in large numbers or attacked in large numbers. I think people, China, Hong Kong and Macau are very fortunate in not having experienced very much violence, and so I think when what happens in Hong Kong now, people tend to see it as much more horrific than it is.
Just because it didn't happen before on this scale.
On this scale.
But when we compare it to other events,
it's really very minor, I think.
We are running out of time, so I'm just gonna. I would like to talk a little bit about the situation in Israel, because we see the increase of racism everywhere in the world, of anti-Semitism, intolerance, a growing of hate, almost like we can say that. And with the recent, the current situation in Israel, you mentioned last year you were pessimistic about the outcome. Are you still, or are you a little?
No, even more. Israel now on second election, still no proper government, a prime minister who seems to, who again is of the Trump school, who is largely populist, who's not in the tradition of previous Israeli prime ministers, who seems to think playing the right-wing racist card is the way to remain prime minister, threatening more settlements, using anti-Arab rhetoric. So I think Bibi Netanyahu is not a prime minister I would like to see in Israel. He's the longest-serving prime minister now in Israel, more than Ben Gurion. And I think in order in order to remain in power, he's trying to take the country to the right, and which is not good for Israel. Moving to the right is not going to solve.
Do you
any
think
problems.
that people are suffering because of that decision?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are lots of reasons why he's going to the right. Because it's part of Israel's ridiculous political system, which is made up of lots of small parties. So he needs the support of the small right-wing parties to form a government, and so he's creating policies to find support amongst the minority right-wing parties. I mean, if it was a first-past-the-post system, he wouldn't be kowtowing to the extreme right. But in Israel, certainly, it's a mixture. I mean, on the one hand, on the one hand, Israel's moved to the right, and at the same time, there is a growing anti-Semitism, certainly in Europe and even the United States of America, and that allows the Israeli government to now use the fear of anti-Semitism to make people say we need a strong right-wing government to fight anti-Semitism. So unfortunately, it becomes self-reinforcing. No doubt, there's definitely been a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, where it didn't necessarily feature very largely before.
Because Israel's being painted as evil because of the decisions that are made by
because for some reason Jews are always held to a different standard, which itself I think is anti-Semitic.
You have a lot of projects on studies. Also, the British in Macau is another theme that we could talk to you about, literature and the Holocaust. I want to ask something about something you mentioned here in this show last year, that you have, the Holocaust Center in Hong Kong. You guys held a concert, a performance of music written by people in concentration camps.
Yeah.
And your wish was to play it in Macau.
Yes.
How is that going?
I'd still love to do it. I haven't pursued it. I must. I need. The last 2 years we've had the 27th of January Holocaust event in Hong Kong, United Nations Holocaust. I have managed to find 2 very wonderful musicians from Macau who've gone to Hong Kong to perform, a violinist and a cellist. So I have managed to make some inroads within the Macau music community, and I need to push a bit further with that, but I think it's possible.
We are a few months away of the Remembrance Day, like in January again. Do you already have any plans that you would you could announce?
That's a wonderful question, because I was hoping you might be ready, because that's fantastic. I have a very exciting. We're going to have the most amazing visitor. You might even want to have her on your show. The Holocaust survivor we're bringing over is a woman called Ava Schloss. She's 90 years old.
She wasn't related, but she was something with Anne Frank?
Indeed, yeah. She was in Auschwitz-Birkenau where, with her mother, her father and brother were killed. Before the war, it was during the Holocaust, before, she was a friend of Anne Frank.
Exactly.
After the war, so her father and brother were killed, her mother marries Anne Frank's father. So she's actually the posthumous stepsister of Anne Frank. She was brought up by Anne Frank's father.
All right.
And she'll be our guest.
She will be your guest in Macau or
in Macau.
Hong Kong? In Macau.
On the 15th of January, she's coming to Macau. And then she'll be in Hong Kong for about 5 or 6 days.
In the University of Macau?
In the University of Macau. So the next month, I'm going to be writing to the schools and head teachers to say, please bring your students to the university, because we're going to do a big event at the university where she'll speak.
All right.
Because this is a chance to meet not only a woman whose own story is truly extraordinary, but a woman who actually is a living link to perhaps the most famous Holocaust victim. I mean, everybody knows Anne Frank, has read Anne Frank's diary, and this is a woman who actually is one of the last living links with Anne Frank. So I hope you might have her on your show.
All right, yeah, for sure. And the 15th of January, something not to miss. Thank you so much for being with us on the show. This is all the time we've got for tonight. We'll be back next week with a new guest on TDM Talk Show. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Thank you.